places in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello, welcome to Varn Blog, and today I'm here with Dr. Daniel Tutt, psychoanalytic theorist, professor. What are you professor of exactly?
I do various adjunct of philosophy.
Okay, philosophy.
I teach philosophy at many places.
And we use professor here in the loose sense because I don't believe in academic hierarchy anyway. So
yeah, I'm with you on that. Amen to that.
It's always the adjuncts to do all the work. So used to be one of them. So we're here to talk about the philosophy and psychoanalysis of Christopher Lasch. We're going to be talking about his relevance to the moment. And Daniel also hosts Jouissance Vampires, you are one of the semi-regular host over at New Zero Books.
Yeah. Right.
And you do something else.
Yeah. Yeah. I also do, since COVID started, this pandemic, but it's kind of, I insist that it live beyond the pandemic, even though academic conferences have actually in a very strange way been really rigid with Zoom. So they've like totally closed down because if we're honest, the pandemic opened up a kind of democratization of academic conferences, which, people have to get on a flight, they have to buy a hotel. Often it's not paid. Okay, why not Zoom? But now actually I'm witnessing this very startling dynamic where universities and colleges, etc., are canceling Zoom options entirely. It's really restrictive, to be honest. Okay, sure, we have Zoom fatigue. I get it. But you want me to drop $1,000 just like that? I don't know. So that's a whole other thing. But anyways, my study groups has been hosting really senior theorists and philosophers to come on. Senior, just simply people that have written many books and have been doing it for a long time. And it's been interesting. I've also been interested in shifting more to a debate format, a comradely debate format. So I have a big thing I'm planning right now, which actually is probably going to be an in-person event in New York City with Assad Haider, Max Tomba, Harrison Fluss, and Landon Frim on what Marxism has to say about the Enlightenment. Basically, where do ideas come from, and does philosophy matter in Marxism? And so that's a clear debate. But I'm more interested in creating some of those opportunities for comradely exchange, just so we can learn, at least at the minimum, to talk to each other better. I know you're interested in that too.
Yeah, let's say that's the mission of this show. It's something I think a lot about, in so much that I don't love performative debates. In fact, I'm on record as basically saying that if you don't share 80% of a worldview with me, I'm not going to debate you. I'll have a conversation with you, but we don't agree on enough for there to even be terms for us to win or lose, and I've also, talked about how leftists need to learn how to talk to people who are deeply opposed to them more. Yes. But that does not mean platforming demagogues and ideologues uncritically or in an adversarial way, which just reinforces both sides of the narrative.
Yeah.
And I have found the best way to do that is in some way conversation, if you think the person is amenable to conversation. I do like I do like, however, this kind of salon debate style where we were broadly on the left and have, say, radically different views on one element of it. I think that's useful. But I also am not sure that I totally see the point of debating that so much as just presenting it and talking to each other about where we're talking past each other. And that leads me to today, because we're going to be talking about Christopher Lasch, psychoanalysis, and to some degree on the family. You've been working on him, and I've been working on him separately. I'm writing a book. You're doing all kinds of stuff. Your interest is mostly actually on psychoanalytics and theories and notions of the family. And I was reading an interview Lasch gave, I think around 1991. So it's after True and Only Heaven, but was written, but I think before or right after it was published, because I think he just found out he had cancer. And he talked about how he wrote Haven in a Heartless World, and how he realized that it was missing something and that his earlier works were missing something. And he said, after that point, I started leaning heavily on psychoanalysis, which is obvious if you read subtly. Also, he just says it, but not obvious if you're a leftist, because the traditions of psychoanalytic theory that we pull from tend to announce themselves loudly because of their specific vocabulary.
Right.
Whether that's Frankfurt School, Freudian Marxism, or Lacanian left analysis, or Žižekian Lacanian. I mean, they're like, but you're dealing with something just by the word choice.
Right.
And Lasch doesn't come from that school of psychoanalysis.
Right.
He's pulling, in my mind, from well, actually, I'm gonna let you talk more about that. But he pulls a lot from Norman O'Brown, explicitly.
Well, actually, I would. That's an interesting point you make, because I feel that Brown was a libertine Protestant mystic. Let's talk about Norman O'Brown very quickly. He was a kind of celebrated professor in the humanities. He was quite an early, let's say, experimental left avant-garde. John Cage and him were close buddies. He was obsessed with James Joyce, just a huge admirer of Finnegan's Wake. And in the late 60s, he got a grant to basically do what Lacan was doing, which is just think about it very modestly for a second, without all of the pomp and BS around Lacan. What was Lacan's message, which is simply return to Freud. So it was just an exegesis on Freud. And that's what Brown did in his book, Life Against Death. He just read Freud quite rigorously. And I think that Lasch basically did the same thing. So during that time, you had a renaissance of people literally just going back and reading Freud. And a few generations had kind of passed. We have a completely different dynamic at play. Like, for example, if you were to read Wilhelm Reich's Mass Psychology of Fascism, clearly there's a historical periodization from that time of like early budding Nazi period to this kind of post-war consumer capitalist situation. And actually in Slavoj Žižek's review of Culture of Narcissism, if you read it closely, he basically says, look, Lasch is pretty much correct on most of the psychoanalytic theory, but what he says is that what Lasch is missing is a clear account of how you move your theory of what Lasch calls the culture of narcissism, which we can define as some kind of collapse in the efficacy of ideal ego formations, which, importantly, Lasch sees a certain moment of the rise of American bureaucracies after the First World War as putting forward what he calls a heteronymous theory of the subject, which was basically a theory of civic citizenship in America in which things like responsibility, sacrifice, commitment to the social good was present. And I think Roosevelt's New Deal period was a kind of limited time in which that kind of model of let's call it a more stable subjective formation was present in America. And Zizek says Lasch doesn't theorize how and the kind of dynamics, the historical conditions in which it collapsed. I don't know if that's true. I actually think that Lasch does actually.
Yeah, I was going to say he does.
He does actually do that because,
but he doesn't so much in that book.
His other work, he just read Culture of Narcissism, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he doesn't. But I think that okay, and so I'm just going to say that, and then I can kind of flag a few really important Laschian concepts that I think will help us understand why he's insightful and why he is such a wedge of a kind of like when I interviewed his daughter, Elizabeth Lasch Quinn, and I said or asked her, so can you talk about, your father's politics? And she literally said, I can't, because they have been subsumed by the discourse. Mm-hmm. They're disembodied. Something has happened to him in which, a bit like Nietzsche, although obviously these two figures are very distinct from each other, but you see they become channeled and this kind of lightning rod for something that is not coherent or centered for their own position. And of course, I think as we were mentioning before we started the show, it's extremely important to recognize that in this kind of strange eternal return of some of the same culture war dynamics that the New Left experienced, for which the name Christopher Lasch was a polarizing name, he is now in a paradoxical way returning as a polarizing name. And there's a certain, I wish to say, specific reason for that. I think there's a kind of very specific reason why Lasch polarizes specific groups, and what I haven't figured out is how to kind of conquer that issue, because he sometimes can polarize to a great degree. And I can share some kind of observations there if you'd like. I mean, just briefly, recently I was at the American Psychoanalytic Association, which is the, a very, very prominent, the most prominent psychoanalytic association. It was their annual conference in Boston. And I was honored to be there. And it was on a panel on the family. And, and this was an audience full of very wealthy, very well-established psychoanalytic practitioners, boomers mostly, okay? And I was discussing my book on the family, and I centered Lasch in part because I was trying to make the argument that, look, actually, Lasch diagnoses the conditions of late capitalism, consumer capitalism, whatever you want to call it, quite well. And we can benefit from his analysis without falling sway to a kind of conservative reactionary co-optation, let's say. And that's my proposition. This is, maybe you could say, Derick, a kind of ethical proposition. And then the question is, how do you do that? Is there, and then my co-panelists, who I respect tremendously, from queer and transgender communities, responded to me with a profound emotional response, where they argued that one cannot separate an analysis from a kind of normative incorporation. In other words, in their view, if you adopt the Laschian perspective, you have to be prepared to face the kind of consequences. And what are the consequences? Well, basically, the consequences are something like the reaffirmation of a kind of patriarchal vision, number one. Number two, the consequences are something around a support for tradition, which can include populist tradition. It can include petty bourgeois, small business owner fetishization, we could say. It can include it can include traditions in their plural sense, which for my comrades, this goes back to my debate with Catherine Liu. Before I had the debate with Catherine Liu, or conversation with Catherine, I was coming from this experience. Catherine was saying, look, we have the ability, the power, the liberty to fully affirm Lasch's position. And like, we should not be ashamed, or we should not be fearful of any of the consequences of saying we're Laschian. And here I am coming off of this experience in which I was told, I was communicated to, that actually you need to be much more sensitive to how you're using his thought. And that's why I was taking the position of like, look, that is something that I value. I value that community's perspective, and I'm happy to be careful. With that said, I'm not going to say that I'm not going to necessarily agree that Lasch's theories lead to an inevitable reactionary position. I think that that's too strong. However, I think that it is also possible to synthesize Lasch and to see the ways in which, yes, there are aspects of a desire, after reading his work, Minimal Self, Culture of Narcissism, the works that's theory heavy, there is, I think, Derick, you might agree, a sense in which, yes, the left can't talk about fathers. That's true. Let's do it, right? For our comrades on the libertine kind of left psychoanalytic view, I was in another event, and there was expressed an interest in which actually, as Marxists, it's important that we transcend completely the father as a structure of a kind of a limited prior form of an oppressive mode of social reproductive life that should be thought of as fundamentally overcoming. The communist revolution overcomes that, and that any nostalgic identification, right, with even the bourgeois family. Now, of course, I raised the point there, Derick, which is, when we talk about identification to bourgeois family, it was the Frankfurt School that Lasch was reading, as you know, and one of the points that Horkheimer makes in his text on the family is actually a question around the fact that we must be honest that at certain points in history, the bourgeois family did produce a subjectivity which could deal with authority in a more thorough and healthy way and overcome dependencies in ways which late capitalism, consumer capitalism, hasn't been able to produce. Because that is one of Lasch's big frustrating insights, which is that we have an illusory form of liberation today. We have horizontal, pre-Oedipal freedom. We have this freedom, which is still reliant on a kind of uber parental superego, what he calls social superego, which is cruel and acephalic, basically. And of course, that theory of the social superego also further alienated socialist feminists like Jessica Benjamin and Dinnerstein, because that argument was that the superego is a cruel, sadistic mother. And Lasch, you see, this is where Lacan is better, because Lacan would never literalize such a claim. And I think Lasch, because he's working with a traditional Freudian model, he becomes perhaps rightly accused of taking these categories of paternity, mother, father, and kind of literalizing them, if that makes sense. For Lacan, the father function is metaphoric, and Lacan actually gives a much better theory for how to treat the crisis of the name of the father, which we can talk about, right, than does Lasch. And that's why Lacan has been used by feminists and Lasch has not. But what I try to show is that Lacan and Lasch are saying things that are quite close to each other, in fact. Okay.
Well, I mean, and both get accused of being crypto-religious.
Sure. Yeah.
And I would say in Lasch's case without evidence, in Lacan's case with some evidence.
A lot of evidence. Oh, of course. I mean, Lacan was a Pascalian. Lacan was a Jansenist within the Catholic Church, which are the Catholics who believe in predestination.
I was about to say they're basically Calvinists.
Yeah, they're very fascinating. And there's a whole theory, actually, that Lacan was obsessed with from Lucien Goldman, which was that modern bourgeoisie, European bourgeoisie, formulated its ideology of the elect off of Jansenism. And so, however, Lacan had a very sophisticated way of thinking about things like the elect and authority, which was ultimately what got him barred from the International Psychoanalytic Association, because at the core, Lacan was probably a lot more radical than Lasch was. And in my opinion, we can talk about that as well.
Yeah, we might.
Yeah.
We're on Lacanian territory. I'm open to the fact that I have read Lacan, but I do not feel comfortable with Lacan. Never have, and that is because I find some of the specificity actually for me has been, I hate to say corrupted, but I think it's actually accurate here by secondary literature, because I went with, unlike most scholars who I approach primary sources first, my introduction to Lacan was explanations about Lacan in grad school, not the straight stuff until much later on my own. And I felt like I had about 50 different explanatory things that obscured what he was saying. Now, I think that's interesting, because I think this is another way in which him and Lasch are weirdly similar, but you won't know it because of stylistic reasons. And that is, Lasch does not write in a way that calls out that his concepts are not everyday use concepts. And in fact, his whole style guide, if you get a hold of it, was, basically the notes from his students published, I believe, in 2002. It's more or less, write specifically, write like academic, but don't write in such a way that non-academics can't understand you. The problem that engenders in Lasch is that he kept on having to write books to explain other books, because people didn't catch that, like, he wasn't using narcissism in the colloquial way like Tom Wolfe. Right. So he had to write the minimal self. Almost, if you look at his first 4 books, each book is another set of essays explaining more of what he tried to explain in the prior book, historically. And what is interesting from theory heavy Lasch and early Lasch, and this is what I was talking about, I discovered in 1991, is that he deliberately doubles down on the Freudianism. It had been in his earlier work. It comes up in Agony of the American Left. It comes up in World of Nations. Yeah. But it's never... It's in his, like, dealing with the Frankfurt School's abandonment of the working class. It's not as an explanatory model as such. And
you're right, because Lasch could have taken a more grandiose approach. Lacan takes a grandiose approach, which is very French, which is to say, I am going to say something about the symptom of our civilization as such, right? We live in the era of the decline of the father function, and here is a formula to understand that. That's not something Lasch is going to do. He's working on a much more modest American Frankfurt School style approach, where he's dealing in an ingenious way with cultural and social examples, primarily. But as you know, one of the other great things about Lasch is that he studied very carefully what the psychological and psychiatric community was producing, of course, the self-help literature as well, and as well as wide swaths of all kinds of different young adult literature. He was trying to develop a composite psychic conception. Yeah, and let's take a step back and ask, what would a more grandiose Lasch claim be? One of them would be that the thesis of the culture of narcissism represents the decline of Oedipus. He doesn't say that straight out, but that's kind of the implication. Why? Because basically what he says is that the culture of narcissism, in a traditional Freudian sense, is defined by pre-edipality. Now, what is pre-edipality? Pre-edipality is actually a quite catastrophic situation, if you want to be on it, in my opinion. It's regressive. It's a situation in which subjectivity undergoes an inability to work through constitutive stages of self-development. It's a situation in which there's a stunting, because Freud is very dialectical, right? There's primary and secondary narcissism. There's a passage from ego ideal to ideal ego. There's always this dialectical movement in the theory of Oedipus. And the theory of Oedipus is basically about, you could say, maturation. Some psychoanalytic theorists use stages of development. Some don't. Lacan was opposed to the notion of stages of development. Lasch is more in line with that. And what he's basically saying is that there is a stunting of self-development. There's a crisis, and this is what I get my subtitle crisis of initiation, which is a kind of, you could call it an identity crisis, but even to call it an identity crisis is it's much broader than that. It's a kind of, and this is also why Lasch is perceived as subversive, but also conservative, in the sense that one of the things he loves to show, and you'll know this as well, is that Protestantism actually contained, in the 19th century and before, a libertine transgressive relationship to the law within the family structure, which we have neglected, because we only talk about Protestantism as this patriarchal authoritative thing. But Lasch showed in careful detail that that's actually not true, that there's many Protestant communities in which the maternal was given more power than the paternal, for example. And so Lasch could lean back on the idea that actually it's quite radical to allow for a child to undergo a process of overcoming paternal dependencies. Because that's the other thing, is that if the social order of the culture of narcissism is pre-Oedipal, that actually means that Oedipus, as a process, what is Oedipus? Oedipus is a process of overcoming that kind of unresolved, ambivalent identifications and attachments that you have to your parents, which then spill out to other parts of your life. So you kind of have strained work relations. You have trouble with your peers. That's pre-Oedipality. You have aggressive identifications for which you don't have a register, a motive ideal in which to sublimate them. That's where the cruel mother, the social superego comes in. And if that is your register of processing recognition, because this is another thing that could be a conservative reading of Lasch, everyone knows about how in philosophy, Hegel has this theory of social recognition, right? Lasch, in his theories, actually, in my reading, Derick, and you may disagree, actually says, look, the culture of narcissism, this pre-Oedipal thing, is also a crisis over inadequate recognition. We no longer have mentors or people in our life locally, communitarian basis, that actually push our desire through the proper overcoming of these dependencies. Rather, we have this kind of acephalic identification, which is almost kind of a ubiquitous. It's what in Lacanian thought they would call the big other, which I never liked that concept because it's too jargony for my liking. I like Lasch's notion of social superego, but one thing that's important to note there is that Lacan's ethics is one in which one must come to the recognition that there is no big other, right? That this demand for a kind of approval from this kind of overarching source of authority, social authority, let's say, like when you struggle day to day to make it in life, you have to ask yourself, who are you doing that for? In Lasch's view, there was a time in which that struggle of recognition was a much more localized one. a much more communitarian one. And I think that Lasch's late politics and his communitarian turn could be understood as an attempt to, and this is why it's an anti-politics. You call it anti-liberal, you could also call it anti-politics. It's a retreat. It's a retreat back into an experimental place in which we shrug off this acephalic social superego aggressive thing. Because when we get attached to it, there's a whole class dynamic that occurs there, right? There's a whole class dynamic which, not everybody gets recognized in the right way. So there's a whole crisis, I wish to say, of recognition that Lasch positively identifies, which we're still absolutely dealing with this issue. So, that's some of the sort of I think sound observations that Lasch has bequeathed to us. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, one of the things I think about we kind of have to deal with is that Lasch is not anti-identitarian in the way that a lot of people read him as, and that he was not against identity as such. He wasn't against identity politics. In fact, he writes quite a bit about the explicitly liberatory and positive vision of Black nationalism as opposed to the more muddled vision of Black power, even though he has fairly strong criticisms of Black nationalism as a nationalism. It's right. One of the things that's interesting about Lasch, and I think it is important. I started periodizing him into I've gone back and forth when it's 3 or 4 periods. Now I'm calling it 3.5 periods. There's the historian of the left as critic as cultural critic of the left. Those are the first. That's Liberals in the Russian Revolution, The Agony of the American Left, World of Nations, and New Radicalism in America, which are the history of left thought. There's a transition book, Haven in a Heartless World. And I say it's a transition book because it's more in tone like the 2 theory-heavy books we're mainly talking about today.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have the psychoanalysis in it. It's really not explicitly there. And that's Haven in a Heartless World, which is the first book where, even though he writes a lot about the history of feminism even before then, but that's where he pisses a lot of people off, frankly.
Yeah.
And he starts getting a conservative following during his life, which he bristles at.
Right.
Then we have what I call the period of despair, which happens after Minimal Self. You have him writing a lot of essays between the completion of Minimal Self and True and Only Heaven, including the infamous one in Cocoon, which I go back and forth. And that essay, I think, is frustrating. And I get why people react to it. I get why post-leftists like it. I get why paleo-conservatives like it. It's where you see the communitarian turn. But then by the time you get through True and Only Heaven, you realize there's not a single turn he feels like he can make. He doesn't really truly embrace any of the 3 popular forms of communitarianism that kind of exist at the time. He tries to go back to populism, but people who read him now don't read his early books and know that he literally wrote 4 books that 1/4 of them are about critiquing the populist movement. He's aware of the problems.
I love the early stuff, because one of the things that Lasch is ambivalent about, which we started on, is this. Okay, look, when Walter Lippmann founded the New Republic in I think 1917, right as the U.S. was going into the First World War, the big idea there was that the future panacea is not socialism. It's not a kind of workers' struggle, which is what Lasch was sympathetic to, because what did Lasch want in that period? He wanted American Bolshevism to flourish. It did not. It did not. Rather, the Lippmann-Dewey vision flourished, which was corporatization and the kind of bureaucratization and I think what a lot of people don't realize is that had a short shelf life, which was, according to Lasch, promising. Yeah, promising. Even prior to McCarthyism, prior to the Red Scare, there was this little window in which you had a kind of communitarian, localist process of subjective citizen responsibility, a kind of ethic of sacrifice. And, again, Lasch is more ambivalent here because his roots have, I think, sympathies with Bolshevism. He sees that the way that the country was headed after the First World War, that was off the table. But nonetheless, there's an ambivalence there that I think is really interesting to me, because but then as time goes on, this bureaucracy begins to be the harbinger of this shift away from the heteronymous structure of kind of social recognition that was stable and so on, into a fundamentally chaotic pre-Oedipal dynamic. And from there, it's kind of all downhill in a way. It's very turbulent, right? American life is diminishing returns, right? It's turbulent. It's this kind of one catastrophe after the other, right? And so I think that he's a bruised figure at a certain point in time, and that's not surprising at all. I think that people, we should never underestimate the toll that it takes to be a public figure and to actually care about these things, right? To actually be in the thick of thinking through where we are, what our condition is, and to actually engage in debate with people. And Lasch is, because of his writing style, reached a level of fame, which was quite significant. And I think the other thing I wanted to go back to quickly that really interests me is that going back to this thing of Lasch as the psychoanalytic theorist, okay, so he's working with Otto Kernberg's theory of narcissism. And Otto Kernberg's theory of narcissism is what's called pathological narcissus. It's a kind of something close to what you might call a kind of borderline subject, borderline between kind of like psychosis and hysteria. In other words, it's a kind of the grid of the standard Freudian evaluation of neurosis, perversion, psychosis is fundamentally unclear. And why is it unclear? It's unclear because the paternal function had collapsed and you don't have the same Freudian superegoic social situation in which the neurotic can be kind of defined clearly. So in the culture of narcissism, Lasch is really pointing out this is a tendency of our culture. This is something that is being produced. And I think that a lot of interpreters maybe read this as in oh yeah, we're all it's the age of narcissism and we're all this kind of we've all gone mad, or we're all sort of quasi psychotic. And I don't actually think that's what he was saying. I think that when you deal with psychoanalytic theory, there's always this thing that I've run into myself because I'm not a psychoanalytic practitioner, which is it's really, really hard to talk about the structures of and then apply that to social phenomena, because those structures are defined and realized in a highly contained space, which is the analytic consulting room, right? And they are derived through free association, and you need huge amounts of case studies in order to make a claim about collective subjectivity. What do I mean by that? How that works in psychoanalytic theory is that you have what's called a paradigm case study. A paradigm case study like the Rat Man, right? A case study which or President Schreber, right? Schreber is so important, not just because of what happened to Schreber, but because what Schreber represents at the historical conjuncture in which he was operating, right? It's a kind of macrocosm case. One of the interesting things about psychoanalysis is that psychoanalysis is not produced paradigm defining cases in our time. Very few. There's some as a debate. It's a big debate that happens within the analytic community. And that leads us to think, because like in Freud's time, you could produce these paradigm cases, right? So there's that issue, which is all I'm trying to say is that Lasch is dealing with psychoanalytic theory through a kind of an insight model. And this kind of points something out. It kind of shines a light here. But we should never be very literal when we read that, if that makes sense, you know?
Yeah. I think about a letter written to New York Times by Henry Friedman, the Harvard psychiatrist, who accused Lasch of just misappropriating narcissism to quote battle experts and his instinctive dislike for progressivism. Now, Lasch did have a dislike for progressivism in a particular sense. By that, the kind of what we would now call the Steven Pinker-esque assumption that the world is always getting better through scientific development. He is skeptical of that and seems skeptical of that his entire career, though it's not fully articulated until the 90s.
Well, Lasch is a workerist. I think one of the important things to understand is that I think there's a category in Marxist thought that Lasch cannot think, and that's a category of petty bourgeoisie. And I think he cannot think that for his own familial reasons, which is that's where he comes from. Small craft workers, rural, independent from large industry. Those are Lasch's people. That's where he comes from. And I have a lot of sympathy with that because in a way, that's where I come from. I mean, I come from an extremely conservative family. Mm-hmm. Nobody understands my Marxism or anything like that. So Lasch is somebody for people like us that can bridge. That's actually a charitable thing I wanted to say, which is in Lasch as culture war figure. Maybe there's a more charitable or kind of more proactive way we can think about Lasch as a kind of bridge. That's how I want to think about him, because I think that you would agree with that. I hope.
Yeah, I do. I mean, what I would say about I'm writing a chapter on this because me and my co-author there are two things that we fight about. We're very close friends. And one of them is occasionally I'll be more sympathetic to the feminist criticism of Lasch than she is. And the other thing is that I accuse him of being a workerist in both the good and bad sense. And for the similar reasons that you do, I find his class categories are maddeningly confused, even in the early work. Like he writes all about Mormons as an expression of the early 20th century. I mean, the early 19th century working class that went more conservative over time in World of Nations. And I was literally thinking, I'm like, well, yeah, but they're petite bourgeois and sharecroppers. So they're like quasi peasants are their small business owners.
Right.
Like, I don't know that you can draw a conclusion. And this gets worse in later works, like in The Revolt of the Elites. There's this love of the artisan as the expression of the worker that I think expresses the parts of Lasch that are totally copacetic with conservatism, partly because of their class base. I mean, and we see the same kind of conflation of worker as blue collar, regardless of relationship to production. It's just physical labor.
This was the biggest insight I got from interviewing his daughter, which is that Lasch's theory of alienation. In what sense does capitalism alienate? It alienates in the sense that it strips us from the dignity of work. It strips us from a form of work that would allow for the proper leisure and the proper cultivation of craft emphasis. Of being able to have leisure time to pursue something where you become really great at it, right? Now that is congruent with Marxism for sure, but it's not necessarily congruent with an anti-capitalist position, in my view.
Right.
So that's the kind of tension there that I think a lot of Marxists it's going to be a non-starter, that kind of workerist vision. Because again, as you know, Lasch forecloses, for complex reasons as a historian, any commitment to revolution.
Right. Yeah, I mean, he is clear. He is clear in his ambivalence on that in World of Nations, and the kind of infamous essay, Is Revolution Obsolete? Which the answer seems to be no, but the conception of it is so far removed from what we've historically meant by it, or its current expanded analogous things that we use in marketing, that we almost can't know what it means now. And then by the time you get to True and Only Heaven, by that point, he really does seem to believe that it's foreclosed. Like,
yeah. But he has initial sympathies for it, going back to his dissertation on American Bolshevism, because in reality, American Bolshevism was a fascinating period of time. I mean, you had a lot of intellectuals, a lot of great writers who had profound sympathies with the Bolshevik cause, with revolutionary Marxism. And Lasch, I think, wrote a lot about trying to understand the disillusion of that.
Right.
And I personally have been fascinated by that. But, you know, the other thing, because he has those commitments, he can sit down at the same table as socialist feminists who put forward a vision, let's say, of the family that Lasch is going to, from his psychoanalytic perspective, put under scrutiny, and he's going to deny. I mean, he's obviously going to be, I think, comradely in his denial of that, but he's not a family abolitionist at all, right? And, you know, one of the things that I try to write about is that, you know, that's actually, there's two limitations of Lasch in my view. One is this ambivalent nostalgia for that FDR heteronymous bureaucracy that functioned well. He doesn't really acknowledge it, but I feel that that's the kind of relay point for him, which I think is problematic. And then two, he doesn't want to truly radicalize the bourgeois family. In a way, he kind of just wants to say that, look, the bourgeois Oedipal family had many problems inherent to it. But from the standpoint of subjectivity, from the standpoint of like what Lasch is really after, because if you listen to a lot of his talks, read his stuff, he really is saying, look, we should not be ashamed to want more responsible individuals. And I'm sorry, but the conditions of consumer capitalism we're living in is producing a crisis of authority. It's producing these kind of horizontal, weird dependencies. You know, it's creating all of these rivalries, these issues of solidarity on the left is related to that crisis of Oedipus, I would say. Okay, that's happening, but what does it look like to envision something beyond a bourgeois family? And I think that Lasch doesn't go that far in a way. And I try to suggest a few things. For example, one of the big things is Mark Fisher connected me to this Ellen Wills writer, who's a great socialist feminist author. She's great because she did the New Left commune thing. And a lot of people today would laugh at the idea of the commune as being, they would call that counterculture politics. This is kind of a waste of time, right? This is kind of petty bourgeois narcissism, if there ever has been. But, you know, Ellen Wills was married in a kind of, you know, heterosexual marriage, got divorced in her 20s, became radicalized with the New Left, joined a commune. And her observations are fascinating if you read her work, which is basically that everybody sold out and like nobody was committed to furthering this, right? Like she really wanted to like do commune living all the way. And she felt that it was kind of reduced to a slogan, right? It was reduced to a lifestyle politics. And I think that Lasch, you know, but for me, okay, so for someone like myself, I feel that as a Marxist, it's tricky because revolutionary agitation, revolutionary energy appears under the guise of sometimes very radical liberal intentions. That's just a fact of life. As a socialist, you know, Marxist, I think that it's an ideological question, which is how do you meet those people in such a way where you're not laughing at them, you're not discarding them, you're not fomenting a kind of class hatred towards them. You know what I mean? That is maturity to work with people like that, because that's where the revolutionary energy resides in some ways, if that makes sense, right? Because like we can go back to this later, but the working class is not appearing, in my estimation, as primed for the kind of engagement. I mean, we can work on that and talk about that, but we're experiencing a youthful moment of a kind of, I don't know, a very, this is another reason why we're caught in this new left thing. It's like, you know, a lot of the kind of agitation energy for radical social change is coming from students, and that's problematic. Like, that's problematic. I admit that that's problematic, but how are we going to work through that? How are we going to work through that and not take that kind of adversarial fundamental opposition to it, which just doesn't get us anywhere? You know what I mean? You could get you canceled, and then you could get a book deal, and you can become a sort of savior to some aggrieved subculture community, but I don't care to do that. You know, that's, so it's a tricky dynamic we're in, Derick. I'm raising questions for you. I'm not giving you answers. Just, you know.
Yeah. Well, Lasch has instructed me for a couple of reasons in this regard, but he's also a cautionary tale for me for a couple of reasons in this regard too. Because one of the reasons why I feel like his later work is so despairing, and this I think you've been hinting at, and I have never been able to find a smoking gun of the moment of transition. But in the early works, when you talk about FDR and progressivism and the emergence of an administrative elite, he has an admiration that it's ambivalent, but it's still mostly hostile. He sees both the socialist and the communist movements in America and the populist movements and the early feminist movements as being taken up by people who were from the bourgeois and petty bourgeois classes, but separate from it. And he doesn't know really what to call them. And he actually, in ways that I think modern PMC stuff actually doesn't help, because he does try to delineate like academic radicals from bureaucratic radicals, from bureaucratic conservatives, from administrative types, in a way that indicates that he realizes it's a much larger deal than education, and it's a much larger deal than what Ehrenreich was writing about, both John and Barbara, in the 70s. And I've always pointed out that if Lasch really wanted to use PMC, it was a category, while lost to us for 40 years, for I think good reasons, frankly. It was a category that existed for him. He didn't pick it up. I don't know that he ever read the Ehrenreich. I haven't found evidence one way or the other, but he read prodigiously and commented on, particularly in the late 70s and 80s, he's commented on every damn thing. And so it would not be surprising to me if you knew it.
Well, but Lasch is not the kind of thinker who's going to find the one enemy. This is the most important, you know, subversive element to the achievement of working class politics. He's not that kind of figure. I mean, he's going to give you a broad picture of a very complex situation, right? And so I think that's also a reason why he would not fall into that. But you know, I mean, yeah,
he kind of does fall into it in the late 80s though, when he's like, the left is the problem for the left.
True.
And we can't really call ourselves leftist anymore because, you know, look at these bourgeois feminists and these Trotskyists who blame everything on the working class themselves. And what I find interesting reading Lasch has not just been reading Lasch. Like I read Lillian Rubin, that tripped off that famous essay. And actually, I had to admit that I thought Lillian Rubin misread him, but that some of the points she made were not nearly as dumb as he pretended like they were. And then I read the Trotskyist. He was, I can't remember his name. I think Lichtenberg or something like that. It was unfortunately a very stereotypically Jewish name. And I actually was reading it and I was like, you know what? I would be frustrated with this too, because they're basically saying, you know, now the move would be to say that there is no conservative sentiment amongst the working class, or there's very little, which I find to be a laughable assertion. But I do find that that when we talk about, you know, the center of both conservative and reactionary politics, we usually find either the petit bourgeois or the déclassé there. We don't like different elements of workers go in and out of that. But it's much more fluid. I also get frustrated though reading the stuff from the 80s in particular that's blaming the working class for its own problems because they're stupid enough to vote for Reagan. And I also find that Lasch is right, that even when like Lillian Rubin points out that, yeah, that Lasch isn't wrong, that bourgeois feminism has been used, for example, to lower the family wage, but the family wage was never good enough. And then Lasch actually, interestingly, actually agrees with her. He doesn't actually object to what she's saying. I mean, he gets really haughty about it, but he actually asserts that, yeah, and she was right. The family wage never was enough. He does some interesting things with moving. When she insists on talking about the bourgeois family, he moves to talking about the traditional family, which I found interesting because in earlier work he doesn't do that. That is specific to this this post 87 stuff.
Yeah, this is why I really like his relationship with the scholar Eli Zaretsky, who's also still alive and who is also a scholar, psychoanalytic theorist of the family. And Lasch wrote a really good introduction to Zaretsky's book on. Zaretsky has a beautiful theory, which is that the category of what we today call personal experience, which by the time of Culture of Narcissism had become uber commodified, and you know, everything like when liberation is reducible to personal experience, it's like, you know, you're basically in what Pierre Bourdieu calls the petit bourgeois habitus. Like the petit bourgeois habitus has just enveloped everything, because that is what Zaretsky's argument is, which is in turn of the century socialist feminist agitation, the demand was for women to actually enter the workforce for the first time so that they could get a break and a reprieve from the labor which was unpaid in the proletarian family. And entering into the workforce allowed them to have a wage. In time, some members of that proletarian class, especially women, began to experience the leisure time that can come with decently paid wage labor. And that is what Zaretsky pinpoints as the birth of personal experience. So it kind of comes out of, that's another interesting thing that Lasch helps me understand, which is very important for our present. And when I was speaking to my libertine comrades today, I was trying to make a point which Lasch makes as well, which is, if you think about it, you know, the far left and its interaction with academia has actually had a big influence historically on shaping the institutional life of America. And one of the big examples that Lasch points out here is, where did the idea that adolescence is a period in one's life which is to be kind of, eventually it became commodified, but is to be understood as a kind of liberatory zone. Like, you know, today we have this obviously going on in the trans community with puberty blockers and this kind of, there's a residue of this thing which Lasch shows in his book Haven in a Heartless World came out of the ideas of socialist feminists and their interaction with liberal social scientists within academia who created the model of the family. And so radical ideas inculcate themselves into, because remember, for Lasch, the family is also to be understood as the creation of social scientists, of academics. And I always think it's important to humble academics that actually, you can call them pseudo-radicals, fine. But as you're calling them pseudo-radicals, they're also like policy architects.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Lasch, it's a humbling insight, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah.
Sometimes we look at academics and we say, oh, it's just, they just have leisure time, they have no influence, they come up with these radical ideas, it's hot air. And Lasch does careful studies and shows at certain points in American history, very radical thinking hits the mainstream. I mean, if you have a Marxist view of social history, let's say, it would make sense because the radicality is going to be integrated in the dialectic with liberalism. Like, liberal institutions can absorb Marxist thinking. Look at the Second International period. All of those Marxists that turned liberal came up with many of their ideas. Like, look at the founding of the NAACP, like with William Walling. That guy was a hardcore Marxist. Now, today, what would that mean? That would mean, yeah, anybody within a powerful academic institution that calls itself a Marxist is the sellout, right? I think this goes back to the question of comradeship on the left and being humble and modest and actually holding people to be honest with themselves, that like radical ideas have consequences, and which is why I think we need to up our critique of liberalism. Because look, the family abolitionist tradition right now, Sophie Lewis, that whole community, they can get published in The Nation, they can get published in Dissent magazine, they can get published by all those new left magazines. And I'm not saying that they're not radical, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that we need to understand that the liberal institutions we live with absorb very radical ideas, and we need to be aware of that and be critical of it in a way that's not going to alienate them radically. I hope this makes sense what I'm saying here.
Oh, it's a large part of what I've been doing. I mean, one of my attractions to Lasch, and particularly his early work, was he did the same thing in a different time period.
Yeah.
But and by that I meant, like, there was a tendency in the 60s and 70s, even on the left, to blame, you know, the liberalism within the new left as a brand new and nascent phenomenon against our grandfather's communism and our father's communism, right? And Lasch makes it pretty clear that in America, that's never been true. That these traditions go back to the 18th, to the 19th century easily, if not the 18th even. Yeah. That some of them are based on American class relations, and on this, despite my problems with his looseness of categories, his actual history and description, you know, even if I don't necessarily agree with all his historiography, is pretty damn sound and pretty rooted in a lot of historical analysis. Is valid. And for example, you know, he really turns on John Dewey and progressive education as building what we would now call educational reform culture. He turns on a lot of the libertinism of the left as creating new markets without realizing it, but also fundamentally dependent upon and not really separate from a standard liberalism. I mean, he does, for example, attribute the cultural importance of the new left to the cultural importance of, you know, the Camelot White House explicitly, and its decline and inability to deal with Nixon, and then you know, the end of Fordism. He kind of traces in real time to being unable to adjust to the fact that none of what they did was done. The new left victories were not the results of the new left. Like, and I think this is one of the things that even today we get kind of lost in this kind of, you know, boomer historiography. And it's ironic that it's boomer historiography because it's really about silent generation people. But where you have this idea that the protests somehow ended the Vietnam War, and it wasn't A, the Viet Cong, and B, Nixon.
Right.
That that the McGovern campaign really revitalized the left, and it's like, well, no, it not only crashed, but we had Reagan very shortly thereafter. You know, but what's interesting about Lasch's late work, for all that I criticize these kind of tendencies and frustrations, and that are coming out of it, one of the things that he says over and over and over again is the right's promise to end this malaise by by ending the Fordist nation state that he was criticizing for so long, didn't deliver at all. That none of the things that said it was going to do happened. The malaise didn't go away. Economic prosperity wasn't generalized. The concerns of the working class didn't only get not addressed, it got worse.
Right.
And he's just floundering at this point, because I think that's instructive, because I think one of the things that when we talk about this kind of repetition compulsion, I think we have with the New Left, and I do think it's real.
It's real. It benefits all of us to, again, like, be humble and recognize that we are repeating patterns, which is a very psychoanalytic point. Sorry to say, because there's an unconscious dimension there at work, and there's structural forces that are putting us into those situations. So the repetition is not some voluntarist repetition. There's structural repetitions by virtue of the organization, the relationship between labor and capital, for very, specific structural reasons, which we could probably break down, right? But I want to say one thing, though, is, this goes back to Lasch's lack of grandiosity. It would be nice if Lasch could take a step back, and I think this would behoove us today, and stake down a little bit more principles. Sometimes Lasch is a kind of journalist empiricist, in the sense that he's sort of observing the left from outside it, and he's a kind of critic of it from outside it. And I think that my view is that we maybe benefit from working within with more principles, if that makes sense. Because the conditions of the culture of the left today are probably more prickly and reactionary prone than they were in his time. I mean, one of the things I talked with Elizabeth, his daughter, about, and she agreed with me, is that, even though the socialist feminists and many others debated him, they actually really admired him. And they had really good exchanges in reality. And we kind of opined that, that kind of, and I think that Elizabeth is quite liberal, because her whole vision, which is an interesting thesis, actually, I can share with you briefly. She thinks the secret to American history that's never talked about is the settlement housing movement in the late 1900s, which it was during the Reconstruction period, in which the Black community experienced the first organization of what would become the Civil Rights Movement. And it was supported by charitable interests. And it presented a model, again, because she's a communitarian. I wouldn't call her conservative, but she's kind of communitarian, liberal oriented. And she really thinks that it's her equivalent of the nostalgic point in American history that we must center, like Lasch's kind of ambivalent thing I was mentioning in the FDR period. And for her, it's so important because it was familial networks of mentors and leadership and positive identifications that allowed for a strength of subjectivity to emerge and to blossom from. And she credits and there was also, of course, all of the intense racism that was going on, and they were fighting, but they were fighting it in solidarity with each other. And the leadership was coming from within, not from without, which is a huge thing that Lasch talks about when he analyzes in a really interesting way what happened with the early Black Panther organizing and how the class interests eroded what the original vision of the Panthers was supposed to be, which was solidarity along class lines with poor whites. Okay, too bad that ship never sailed, right? And Lasch says so. Imagine that, right? Imagine if the principles of the Panthers was to actually organize along that. Who knows what would have happened? Today, we look at that and we would think, oh, that's laughable. This was a serious proposal of people like Huey Newton. And he actually, because I'm doing in my book on Nietzsche, Huey Newton was a Nietzschean. And he really did hold that view. Because he says, when I was bullied as a kid, I always recognized the class position of the whites that bullied me. And he said, I never fought back if it was a poor white. Anyways, I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but
it's interesting that Newton and Hampton, even though they're most celebrated now, didn't ultimately win the debate within the Black Panther Party. It was Barbie Seale and Cleaver and even people more explicitly racial nationalists than that. And again, it's because when we cut off and we talk about this, I mean, there's the dual side of our relationship to the New Left, where on one hand we use it as shorthand, all this fucking hippies and the cultural turn, and that led to post-leftism and this reemergence of ultraism, but then there's another hand in which a lot of these same groups, the anti-revisionist movement that emerged, which I am highly skeptical of, but the USSWP during this period, the height of Trotskyism, as the CPUSA is fading, the beginning of the USRCP and American Maoism, like these, and the Black Panthers being probably the most. Yeah. This period is often lionized as well. And I find both of these things fundamentally wrongheaded. And more interestingly, these people actually serve as a bridge, often quite unknowingly, to a lot of the things that Marxists now have ambivalence and the fight against or adopt. And one of my favorite historical examples of this is, standpoint epistemology, which I've heard people pretend is either essentially Marxist, which I don't think it is, or essentially liberal. And I've been like, no, this actually came out of a stuff in nationalist movement, people reading Lukács, Fanon reading this stuff, then it being brought back by Marxist feminists, particularly Sandra Browning, when she was still, and Donna Haraway when she still had some relationship to Marxism, and then it being expanded and more essentialized, and then being let loose upon the world in memes in the late 90s and aughts, or proto memes, I guess. And I say that story to tell people, like, you can't say we did not play a crucial role in this development, even if we think ultimately it turned out to be a development that was not in our favor at all. Like, we have to be intellectually honest, right, and know our own history enough to be like, we don't excuse ourselves by going, well, their standpoint epistemologist, and we're good dialectical materialists. When I'm like, yeah, but their stuff comes directly out of Lukács. Some of it's some of it's convergent development, but some of it's explicitly lifted. And and I think the reason, one of the really weird things about the time period we're in right now, all right, is the political economy of society has changed totally in a lot of ways. Like, yeah, we're still capitalist here. The MCM circuit still existed and existed in that time too. But it really did seem to most people, not just Paul Sweezy, that monopoly capitalism, as written about by Hilferding and even by Engels, had fully established and somehow removed the contradiction of capital, which was the reason, the logic behind the Frankfurt School thinking that basically the working class was no longer a viable revolutionary subject because they had been subsumed and the fundamental contradiction was over. And while Adorno and Horkheimer don't ever state this in economic terms, Pollock and to a lesser degree Marcuse do. And so this shows up in Lasch. And, Doug Lane, who I have many, we're frenemies. So he sort of broke me out to the world, but also is kind of my Brett Nahr in a lot of ways. and I were talking, and he pointed out to me how much monopoly capital informed Lasch. And then I pointed out to him, yeah, but you can't blame that. You can't blame the current reading on him on that, because he actually writes in True and Only Heaven about the shift from Fordism into neoliberalism explicitly.
Yeah.
And he's aware of the problem that it's posed, and he's trying to tease out, and unfortunately I don't think he did it in economic terms, he did it mostly in cultural and psychoanalytic terms, why that transition happened. And I think one of the frustrating things about later Lasch, all right, and I can hear Shallon in my head arguing with me about this, but is that earlier Lasch does approach it from an outside view, but is still a dialectician and a materialist.
Yeah.
Later Lasch, he's ambivalent about dialectics because he sees it being abused in the 80s to justify progressive capitalism and all this stuff. And he isn't seemingly looking for the kind of economic explanation for what he is seeing at the time beyond what he had diagnosed in the 70s. And I think why that's interesting to me about your point about the New Left, all right, is that we have resurrected all these New Left categories and debates. In some cases, whole cloth, just like the PMC,
but unaware to the interlocutors. Like they're not exactly aware, but it's happening. Right.
You know, I mean, I've been talking with Stephen Hamill of the Measures Taken, you know, the Marxist musicologist out in California. And we often talk about, like, how did it come to be that we are resurrecting terms from time periods that had a completely different political economy than ours?
Right.
And yet I can't say, and I can't say it's just delusion. There is a larger structure that makes this happen over and over and over again. It's not just, it's not just the fact that, there's annoying post-leftists who are spouting off anti-PMC rhetoric as the answer to all our problems. It is also
let's check this out for a sec. So one of the things that the far left has discussed, and you see this coming out of like the ultra left, like I'm thinking here of Theory Communiste or Endnotes, that kind of community, but you also see it in more mainstream Marxism as well. You had Clyde Barrow on your program recently, which is finance capitalism. That period from when we went off the gold standard in the early 70s has fundamentally transformed the relationship between labor and capital. Money makes money off of money. Labor is its agency is weakened to a profound extent, but to the extent that as Marxists we can speak about there being a revolutionary subject, it's actually what they call surplus populations. So therefore they emerge in uprisings which are spontaneous. Now let's revisit Lasch's theory of pre-editability for a second. You can see immediately why Lasch would be opposed to talking about that kind of feral form of revolt, because it is, in a way, very pre-Oedipal, right? It's very regressive. It's very unpredictable. It's not coordinated, communicative, solidarity-based. No, it's a bit chaotic. Yeah, they're going to be burning down the police station. They're going to be rioting, right? That's like, this is something which Lasch would send Lasch back into the communitarian cave, right? My view, and I think because you have an experience with the far left, and our generation has had to have an experience with the far left since alter globalization in the 90s up to when it died, like 2010, whatever, when it died. Occupy gave birth to something new. Occupy was more workerist, kind of combined the insurrectionary with the workerist, and now we're in a kind of new period. It's a dialectic between insurrectionary and workerist. The workerist is wanting to come out. My view is that we need to have a kind of, some kind of solidarity with both tendencies. And, again, goes back to my ethic, right? If we don't see the surplus uprisings as legitimate, and also help from a Marxist class standpoint, keep the people that theorize those uprisings more honest, which means things like talking about how the liberal portrayal of BLM needs to center the class position of the men who are getting brutalized by police as well, in order to address the root of their conditions, right? Which is not happening, right? So like there's these two tendencies which are happening now, and that's good, right? Like we can't just say, oh, it's feral pre-Oedipal insurrectionaries and it's just going to get sucked up into ultra liberalism. It could, but it doesn't have to, right? Like that's the role of like actually talking to people and organizing and thinking about these things, right? That's where that comes into play.
Well, I think you're right, and it's. I think this is why my own position on this actually seems to boggle people's mind, because A, I do come out of the far left. B, before coming out of the ultra left, I actually come out of the far right, and for reasons that I've talked about many times.
Right.
And thus I understand the appeal of some of the conservative elements of Lasch's thinking. One of the things that I think we have to be fair about, and I don't think we've been being fair actually about these tendencies, is the complaint that this I think of Riot Strike Riot, right? The Josh Clover book.
Great example.
And I'm like, the problem with this to me is that this is too incoherent, too chaotic, and yet I say critiquing it as inherently reactive or reactionary, as many sectarian Marxists, be they Marxist-Leninist, so I guess Trotskyist, or social democratic, they all will critique this as that. And I think not inaccurately, but they pretend like that's inherent. And what I find interesting is in, like, say, 1910 in Germany or 1913 in Russia, the people who were arguing this in the original time did not have such rigid views, and if they did, they would have lost. So
that's true. But when Clover and Jasper Barnes and these folks end up coming back, and you see this in some of the Heinrich community, because they kind of fall back on a kind of insurrectionary communism as well, because they're anti-party and they're anti-workerist, and not completely, because Heinrich has support for trade unions. I recognize that, but some of his kind of American readers fall back on that. What worries me is that you kind of fall back, these thinkers, on the safety net of kind of an academia, which takes us back to the ultra left and its strange proximity to like very powerful institutions in American life. And okay, so you have that influence, right? And that at the same time you're poo-pooing the possibility of a worker party, right? You're saying, no, Engels was wrong, we're not in worldview Marxism, forget that, let it go.
I think if you read History of Separation, they go even further than that. They basically poo-poo the idea of worker agency as such, as anything other than politically motivated, than politically structured. That basically the workers are uniquely the only class in history that doesn't have political agency at all. And what I find interesting about that is sometimes they make good points. For example, the construction of the lumpen as a kind of dark mirror to the working class. But then I will point out that, like, well, the lumpenization of the working class is very fucking real. Like, and that's why we use words like precariat, because we're trying to avoid the seeming moralization of the category of lumpen, but we're basically reinventing the same thing. And
you're right. No, you're right. It goes back to this distinction between analytic and norm. Right, with Lasch, can you bring a Laschian perspective and not follow the prescriptive norms that could come from that? My contention is you can. I can read Joshua Clover and actually learn a lot about understanding why neoliberalism produces riots as its primary form of antagonism.
Agreed.
There's like structural reasons for that, and I learn a lot there. But I'm not going to conclude from that insurrections, that all we need is a kind of liberal democratic party apparatus that's kind of absolutely illegitimate and has zero democratic buy-in, and that in that context these insurrections will be at all successful. I'm not going to pretend that that's the case, because that's not the case, right? So like, we should be honest, and I think they should be honest too, right? They should be honest about the power that they have within the institutions, as well as about the fact that, yeah, let us experiment with worker organization more seriously, right? And I don't think that the Jacobin idea that's happening now, and we're flirting with this idea of creating a vague organization, is the best one. I'm much more on this neo-Kautskyist line that a more programmatic party should be on the immediate horizon. And yes, that is not going to be a successful venture for a long time. In our lifetime, it may not be successful, but at least we're planting a seed for our children, right? Like, it's something, right? And so I just feel that I don't, I'm just going to stop.
I don't want us to prove the platypus of the people who know my history know I have a relationship with the Platypus Affiliated Association. I was in it for, I was in it formally for a year, and I was a fellow traveler for a year before that. Right. They were not the only source of my Marxist education, despite what people will say. But I left and left pretty. I was not as famous as I am now, so no one really knew why I left. But Ross Wolf, a bunch of other people left with me, and we cut in wildly different directions. And some of the people who left with us became true Trumpist rightists, even. So like there was a spread of response. Why I bring this up is that I have been thinking about their provocation, and it's essentially pretty much what it is. The millennial left is not only dead but never existed, and I am more of the idea that it failed, just like the alter globalization left failed. And why I say failed and not dead or anything like that is, one, I don't like the no true constant fallacy implied in some of this stuff. But two, failure is something that someone can learn from. And framing it that way is useful. Because it's a provocation for us to do better, so the next generation can do what we did not do. And now we have, basically, you and I are about the same age. We're elder. I believe you're in the same weird gap that I am, where depending on who you ask, we could be very young Gen Xers or very old millennials. And
Zennials. It's called Zennials.
The Zennial thing, right? I do think generational politics can be distorting, but I also do remind people that this is a material condition, in so much that we were defined by different, not just cultural, but geopolitical and political economic situations. And B, when it comes to like cycles of accumulated knowledge, we are now the people who can build something off of our failures. I don't know that I would say that the Jacobin, soft neo-Kautskyism versus cosmonaut hard neo-Kautskyism is, and I know a lot of Jacobinites don't even know how influenced Boschkar is by neo-Kautsky and Austro-Marxist thought, but it's that I don't think the horizon line anymore is really ours. I think the horizon line now is for younger people who listen to us, But what I don't want to happen to us is what did happen to the new left in both its like baby boomer and its silent generation form, where we become frozen in time. And you know who I'm talking about. We all encountered them when we entered the left, right? These people who the world kind of froze when Reagan came to power.
Yeah.
And they've been like holding this line, you know, to use a problematic metaphor, like a Japanese soldier in the Pacific Islands,
Right.
the entire time. And it's been sort of we're losing them now. And I think, and I have been like, well, that's sad and it's bad because there's a lot of knowledge that we are losing, even in this whole repetition of the new left, that's not being imparted because these people are dying. But also, I think it's very easy for us to freeze now in the Bernie moment and for the next 20 years to be something that we just become nostalgic about. And I think we almost saw that instantly with the disarray with Biden when things started looking like they just were going to stall. What I think Lasch is instructive here is that whether or not you agree with them or not, his vision for explaining the left, both psychologically and historical culturally, is extremely helpful in not thinking that all the problems that we had were the fault of these damn hippies in the 70s. And if we just got rid of them, that all this would have gone away. Yeah. Because Lasch is pretty clear that no, these things emerged out of a structure. That structure has changed, but it hasn't completely gone away. And none of these things has been unilaterally good or bad. We can't call it progress, but we also can't clearly call it complete regress either. It's like stalling. And I think that's where we're at. I don't think the next generation of leftists will come out of the academy. And the reason for that is I, in the long term, see the precarization of the academy being probably its eventual, not undoing exactly, but shrinking in society fairly.
Well, yeah, it's there's a kind of a sense in which you know, its own efficacy as an arbiter of being able to speak to the root or the truth of social suffering and social realities, that loses that efficacy as austerity goes and goes and goes. Like there's this constant joke that people make on social media. It's like, when is a Marxist book going to be written where the first paragraph is not, since the economic crash of 2008, Marxism has become more and more of interest. And okay, well, that's a cliche, but it's true. And that means something, right? Like, you know, and, you know, again, you know, to use the psychoanalytic concept, there's a beautiful idea in psychoanalysis called a latency period. It refers to how a traumatic event takes a kind of ripple effect where its actual effects aren't felt for several years, right? And this then becomes in some, because you were talking about Norman O'Brown earlier. Norman O'Brown, unlike Lasch, was grandiose in the sense he's trying to periodize the meaning of psychoanalytic history, psychoanalytic meaning of history. And latency period is really important there because we don't know what the latency period is of the traumatic stuff we just went through with the goddamn pandemic. And now the fact we're entering into a new recession, and we're in a new recession. So there's going to be some kind of reverberation, and that reverberation will likely be insurrectionary in some way.
I think it's both insurrectionary and fascist, or quasi-fascist in some way. But
exactly. There's a whole there's a Janus face to the insurrectionary movement, and this is a fact which I personally think a thinker like Alain Badiou actually can give us a lot of kind of meat on the bones to understand that Janus face, right? Because that's really important. Like that's political literacy to see that. Like when I was speaking to Catherine was like, look, there's going to be an insurrection. It's going to look like a right-wing thing. We're going to have a choice to make. We're going to have to make a decision on that. And we got to get ready for that. Right? And we do. She's right. And we need to tell everybody about that. Like, need to be clear. Like, this situation's messed up, and there's going to be revolts. And it's
you
just
don't want to see it all anti or counter systemic energy to the right by just not participating in it. But I also don't think I'm about to say something kind of aimed at comrades who I'm long associated with, but I kind of don't think you can just pick up, say, the trucker strike or the Yellow Vest movement or the Dutch farmer situation or any of that in an unambivalent, clear, workerist way, nor do I think you can merely condemn it as reactionary or illegitimate totally. And that, I think, and unfortunately, we do not live at a time where people are comfortable with that, with, how, you put it very poetically, very classically, the Janus face nature of these kinds of movements, which is not new. But I mean, like, the Narodnik movement was part of the movement, in Russia. And Narodniks are a complicated populist movement, but by the end of by 1921, even if you're not a Bolshevik supporter, the Narodniks are reactionaries, right? Like they start really siding with the whites, and I think there's a space in these kind of movements where it can go. It really is chaos. It can go in so many directions. There's this productive madness in the sense of just not being classifiable. In it.
That's why I think the residues of Maoism and the mass line are instructive in that sense, because it does give you a kind of almost scientific blueprint of a manual by which you can kind of do an inquiry into the ideological composition of an insurrectionary movement. Problem with that is, where's the organizational wherewithal to deploy the mass line, right? It's very unclear. I mean, Mao's whole point is interesting, because if you take it literally, what you end up with is what I would call a centrist Marxism, which is the Marxist inquirer must find the far left expression in the insurrection, find the middle expression, and find the right expression. Not do everything you can not to further the right, but do everything you can to bridge the center with the left. And that goes back to my debate with Catherine Liu. That goes back to my fundamental position, which is, if we don't make that far left, let's call it center Marxist, I know that's vague, but that's the solidarity that we need. That's not an easy solidarity. It's going to be frustrating. It's going to be annoying. And
both sides resist it. As a person who's been on both sides of that, both sides, but both sides resist it, and will call the person. I joke where I put myself on political spectrum on the left, is I'm like, look, I am either the right wing of the ultra left, or I am the very, or I am the, which unfortunately can mean a lot of things, so I kind of move away from that. Or you take the Marxist center, and I am the councilist adjacent line, because I don't take anti-union positions, I don't take anti-party positions. My stance on parties, however, is that any program has to organically come out of the merger of the worker and the socialist movement, and the socialist movement kind of has to get out of the way on all the aims, and I think that's hard. That's a hard ask for them, for us, actually. I'm not going to them here. Absolutely. I think, interestingly, like you, though, what I find interesting about this debate, and this will be my last point, and we'll take a break, and for our listeners, we're going to go away for a couple weeks, but for us, it'll be probably about 10 minutes. One of the things that I find kind of madly frustrating with this impulse right now is, I think the impulse is not to merge with the left, to try to get the ultra left to be more copacetic to a kind of center Marxist position, the impulse is to tail different kinds of, and I know this will, people in America often think in very binary spectrums, but different kinds of right wings, whether it's that Ben Lewis has now said on the Measures Taken podcast. For people who don't know, Ben Lewis is the translator of the Second International, works with the Communist Party of Great Britain Provisional Committee, likes the Weekly Worker, but he has said, unfortunately, he sees a lot of American neo-Kautskyism in its broader Jacobin sense, as having adopted some of the worst lessons of the right wing of the Social Democrats, unintentionally. Even it doesn't even realize that it did it. To tail bourgeois parties, to pick up centrist and right-wing rhetoric, to be confused in how you critique or even align with a bourgeois party. One of the things that the CPGB, both in Ben Lewis, Mike McNair, all these people are very clear on, is if you want the United Front, we don't even mean the United Front as meant by Trotskyists in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in Latin America. We mean the Second International, which is you only align with them on tactical issues, and you never form a government with them, which in America puts you in a pretty precarious position if you're entering a party. Because these strategies are designed for a parliamentary context. We don't have that. But it kind of means that the moment you make the decision to say, we are going to try to realign the Democrats, you have actually, whether you realize it or not, committed to either a social democratic or a popular front alignment strategy, and you will be bound to them in ways that are probably going to hurt you. And that would be what Ben would say. That's what I say too. And I come to this analysis somewhat independently of him, but that's one problem. And I think the other problem is that it is pretty clear the hypocrisy of the ultra leftist stance. And by that, not so much left communists, because they're pretty actually rare in the real world, but you do occasionally encounter them in small sectarian groups around the internet. But I do mean like communizers, the Endnotes people, those kinds of people who aren't by left communist standards considered left communist, but are still in the ultra left tradition. One of the things I think that is obvious to everybody is, why are all these dudes not just professors, but they're like professor poets, and they're at elite institutions, and they have a ton of cultural capital? It seems pretty weird that they're shitting on the working class in a way that very much sounds like the same kinds of things that emerge from that same group of people 40 years ago, even though it's put in a completely different phraseology and justification. But it does, like the people who thought that the advanced sections of the working class had to be people of color or women necessarily, or that you needed a new class subject altogether, which was something early Lasch writes about, the obsession with students as an oppressed class, which nobody would claim today.
Well, this is interesting, because I mean, I think it's interesting. Like, I had someone on my program who had an obscure protest at an Ivy League school. He was a professor. I won't name names, but he decided not to support public sector unionization amongst the grad students at his university. He didn't really say why, but one could imagine that as a communist, he was basically saying that, because, in the Biden era, public sector unionization has grown a bit, and it's been very visible on social media. And of course, I naturally support it. I think we should all support it without question. It is, however, an exercise in an in-class consciousness building amongst student populations, which we wish for it to be replicated outward. That's one thing that Maoism at certain points was quite good at doing, because it would never insist that the unionization be internal. It actually would be like, nope, actually, drop out of grad school and go into the factory. But that was when we had industrial capitalism. Things were quite different. So how that shift is going to happen, we can talk about at a later time. But what interests me is that if Ben is right, and I think he is, the far left, Clover and others, they have a détente with the NGO social movements, because when the insurrections happen, they're swarmed by the NGO, which is what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, when BLM first happened. Al Sharpton and the entire, not even DNC. DNC came in later. They came in later, but it's the NGO swarm which saps the radicalism. Okay. They have a reliance on, like Aaron Benenev. He's like, I'm against the party. I'm for spontaneous social movements. I'm sorry. Spontaneous social movements means that you're making a complicity with the NGO. And that NGO swarm is extraordinarily more powerful in quelling popular revolt than we give it credit. Like it is it is just as effective as the DNC, if not more so. And of course they work together, of course. Right? So
no, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No, I have seen this in real time since I came back to the United States in more than one event where we get swarmed. And then we get like I remember we were doing private prison and private ICE detention center opposition work, and we won it, but I think we won it frankly because of COVID. However, the neutralizing factor was that we got swarmed with NGOs, and owners of one of the private prison companies, not as a corporation but as an individual, was a progressive lesbian woman who donated to every one of those NGOs and effectively would not give money to the opposition on that issue by itself. And in a lot of these states, particularly southern and western states, there's so little of any public infrastructure to speak of that this kind of NGO, like one person in an NGO, can shut down your funding streams overnight. And they can even do it to mutual aid programs, because one of the things that I began to notice recently is a lot of these mutual aid stuff dried up in the Biden era because we weren't paying attention to where our donations were coming from, and they were still downstream of NGOs. So, and I know a lot of people in the Jacobin left are very ambivalent about this, but they will take that money. I mean, I know they will. I've literally talked to them about it. And, and I'm like, I see that as a de-radicalization that I don't even always think it's always as explicit as the way I'm talking about, or that the people who are doing it even know they do it. But the moment you start accepting NGO compliance, you also accept with it legal strictures that are even worse than on business unions and other things people complain about.
This is why when it comes to the failures of the NGO swarm, all that goes back to the interests of the philanthropic paternal interests that prop them up, which in a very sad reality, the only philanthropic interests that are truly like interested in workerist ends tend to be reactionary. So what that does is gives you things like Compact Magazine, which is a kind of quasi pro-working class, but fundamentally conservative effort. But the sad reality is that you're not going to get from established upper bourgeois philanthropists something that we would want. And it's probably good that we don't have that. We're never going to have that. The neo-Kautskyist turn is never going to have philanthropic support like that, ever. Maybe we'll get a few Rosa Luxemburg foundations in Europe and these kind of distant things that have no real roots in American politics.
Yeah.
But it will never be enough.
Really,
right?
Probably more likely from China, let's be honest. But
maybe
yes,
in time I could see that happening, perhaps. That's a whole other thing.
That's a different debate. But one of the things I find interesting, just to get back to Lasch, and we talked about Lasch's Slam of Cohen and other stuff, but this history Lasch is absolutely good on. New radicalism in America basically talks about this trend going all the way back to the 1890s and the development of like what was bourgeois and academic and even sometimes former aristocratic
We
charity
actually,
institutions.
yeah, what we need actually is left-wing think tanks that can actually do the boring investigative research into these funding streams so that we can understand the ideological makeup and where it goes back to, because we don't know. Like, I'm going to interview Nina Power, the editor-in-chief on my show. My comrades in the trans community have asked me not to make it public, not to platform her. I'm going to do it privately so that I can learn. I want to understand not just why she's doing it, but I'm going to ask her about her funding. Like, I want to know. Like, it's important that we know, right? Like,
Right.
And this is the whole thing with the Dime Square and the kind of vibe shift and that whole arts literary scene in New York, which is supposedly funded by Peter Thiel and running around with philosophers like Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbug, which is a whole other thing, which is insane that that's even happening. But there are philanthropic interests that are working to orchestrate these divisions that we embody and that we inhabit and that we take up. Like, I would even venture to say that part of the repetition of the New Left and all of its tragic repetition in the Hegelian sense versus tragedy then as farce is partially responsible from these groups. And we don't know anything about them, really. We have a vague idea, but somebody needs to do the research.
I agree with you on the think tanks, and one of the things I try to do as best I can is follow the money. But one of the things when you deal with stuff like Compact Magazine, and I think this is important for people to realize, like, I know when, say, Ron Ernst's weird charity gives both leftists and rightists money. I know when even American Affairs, where it's getting its money from. But when you deal with Compact, which is a legally private organization, I have no idea, and a lot of it's speculative, and a lot of it's 2 or 3 things removed. And so when people will ask me sometimes, because I am good at tracing money, it's a weird gift I have. Comes from working in public institutions for a long time and trying to figure stuff out. And this, I'm like, I don't know, and I'm not willing to speculate either, because I could very easily be very wrong. And and I don't want to accuse people of something that's not true. Also, because it wouldn't help you understand what's going on, even if, like some of this is larger than this discrediting people you don't like thing. As far as, like, in a defense of talking to people that are questionable, I mean, one of the things that people have called me out on is I maintain certain contacts and friends that are from my paleo-conservative days, and that is how I know certain funding lines and certain trends before they happen elsewhere, because these people, I wouldn't say entirely trust me, but they do know me. And one of the things that I've been talking to people, and this is something, again, to tie it back to the subject of our initial inquiry here on Lasch, it's super important, and I take this all the way back to Lenin. Lenin talks about having to know the classes in a way that you know their weaknesses and strengths, the way they talk, the way they dress, the way they smell, and who they know. That a socialist revolutionary doesn't just have to do that for the working class. It has to do it for all of them that it can. And this is a problem in America in specific, because we are so micro-segregated, not just by economic level or race. We're micro-segregated by, like, sector now. I mean, like, you can literally guess not just what someone's income level, but what their specific sector of work is by where they live in the United States and what neighborhood they're in. And because of that, I often hear just wild shit coming out of people's mouths, both on the left and the right, about who they think these other people are and how they operate and who is operating them, because they don't know it. And they don't even know it in their central, like, just people on the street way. Like, so you get all these projections about who is and isn't a Trumpist and this and the other. I'm like, these are things that you could figure out if you went out into the world and talked to people and did the research. But the other thing I would say we need to do is we need to learn from the right wing. We always say the left doesn't have money, and I always say, well, we do have money, it's just bad. And people don't get what I mean by that, but you just got to it. It's NGO money. Like, there's tons of it. The right-wing para-institution stuff, which they learned from the old left, by the way, explicitly, they actually make that clear Um, it's partly old left and partly churches. Like that's where they get their social ideas from. We have totally almost ceded to them. Like we don't really have. I mean, we have some. I guess there's some attached to the ASA, kinda. But our need to attach that into a former bourgeois party means that they're not truly independent in a way that, in some ways, the right-wing think tanks actually kind of are. And
in a past life, I did I was a fellow at a think tank that looked at what's called the Islamophobia industry, which is a very interesting phenomenon that occurred during Obama's period. And I was a part of a team that studied its funding streams. And my God, it was robust. Multi-million-dollar coordinated campaign working at various levels to push congressional policies, to orchestrate media talking points for the John McCain campaign and many other campaigns, to train spokespeople locally to direct media. And the interesting thing about it was that none of these organizations that sprouted, and there were hundreds of sort of sub-affiliate local NGOs that were part of this network, had a kind of principled reason for existence other than a disruptive one. It was like a combat organization, right? It was a combat movement, which was meant to distort, disturb, dissociate, and basically in a highly strategic way. And they were successful. I mean, I could send you the report. They were successful, but they also were not. They also were overcome. It's a whole interesting thing. But I kind of feel like somebody needs that. Like somebody should start a Patreon and just like as a side project, just start the research. You can find this stuff on GuideStar. You can go to the Foundation Center and find it. You can do the investigative research. You can find out the composition of like what is ideologically occurring in a material sense on today's left. I think it would be beneficial.
Yeah, I think it would too.
I know it's very empirical point. We went from like high theory now to like the lowest, but maybe that's good.
It's also very Laschian, frankly.
Yeah, it's good.
Like that's something he does actually.
I can do both. I'm a high theory guy, but I also have some experience, surprisingly, in this mundane stuff. Whatever, it's not mundane, but this kind of.
Weirdly, I do too, and so it's very strange. Although I will admit, for me, it was not tracing that; it was tracing how the far right emerged without that institution, because they don't have as many and they're not well funded. And I was actually trying to understand that as a parallel to like the Marxist left, because we also don't really have the same institutions. We're not well funded, but we have been depending on university patronage for a long time. And on this I'm sympathetic, though I think both you and Catherine that's been somewhat deleterious to our ability to affect change, or even be really effective at what we were aiming to do. I don't think it's just for class reasons. I think there's a whole lot of institutional reasons when it comes to the way universities work, but it's and I also you don't think we completely failed. I think we just didn't really control what came out of what we did in the long array of things.
Yeah, I mean, this is one thing that Hard and Negri were pretty good at for all of their flaws in the Empire series. One of their theories was this kind of quasi-maximalist theory, and Badiou's huge on this too, which is look at like, if you really are a Marxist, you have to understand that like revolutionary upsurges produce a kind of mutation in collective knowledge, and they reorient collective knowledge, human knowledge, in that direction, whether the society wants to go there or not. And so like there's ripple effects of demands for liberation, of popular revolt. Like it may not take power. It may be a laborious thing. We're in a dark ages maybe, but we at least have to have the humility to see micro level movements of impact, let's say, right? if we can't see that, then what are we doing? Like, might as well just go barbecue and grill and just say screw it. Right? I mean,
Right.
so there
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah, I think that's a good enough place to end this round on. We will be back, and we're going to be interrogating our strange relationship to Nietzsche. I thank Daniel for coming in and talking to us about Lasch and then its implications now, and our kind of the last little bit about the kind of systemic implications of all this, and why. I think the one thing I will say that I am sympathetic to people about Christopher Lasch, and this will be my final point, that their critique of Lasch is he doesn't offer anything that really solves the problem. And Revolt of the Reliefs is kind of like a scream of populist anguish as to why, and this, I think the problem with that line of thinking is that whether or not you solve the problem doesn't mean the problem's not there. And and these are coming up again for a reason. There's a reason, and it's not just Trump. I know Trump's usually the common explanation, but there's a reason why Lasch is becoming a flashpoint and discussed by leftists again, because for a long time, and I think you know this as well, the only people picking him up were either paleoconservatives or communitarians. Everyone else pretty much would only bring him up to talk about a left-wing guy who degenerated and pretend that he was somebody like Eugene Genovese or one of these Marxists who became out-and-out conservatives. And he was absolutely... I don't think anyone who knows him will claim that. And I do take Elizabeth Lasch Quinn or Quinn Lasch. I can't even remember which order that goes in.
I think it's Lasch Quinn. Okay. And or his wife said the same thing, actually, that you can't project Lasch's politics even from his last book onto now, because it's not clear how he would have reacted. You can't, but
you also have to.
Everyone does. You can't, but everyone is forced to. Yeah, because I think the value of Lasch is he holds up a mirror. Look, charitably, he exposes the left wing of liberalism in a way which can make us all a bit shameful if we're affiliated with it. If you're not affiliated with it, you have no commitments to it, you can stand there and cheerlead for him and say, yeah, this is exactly right. But I am formally, I went through my liberal phase, I went through my progressive phase. I'm not there. I'll never go back to that. So Lasch is somebody who helped me break from that. But I'm now at a place, I think, as we've indicated in this conversation, where we need to take a more middle measured position on him. And also know when not to talk about him. I realized when I was at the conference, I could have said all the ideas without the invocation of his name. I'm happy to not use the name in some contexts. I just won't do it. I just won't, because I've seen people break down in tears for me using the name. It's that extreme. So you got to be really careful. I'm serious. That may sound weird, but trust me.
I think people need to be more careful about the way they speak about a lot of this stuff in general.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Like my recent example is like on culture war issues, you don't have to throw people under the bus, nor do you have to use the particular weird phrases on the left when you're not talking to leftists, because they do strike outsiders.
But it is also a libidinal thing. Let's just flag this, and maybe this is our final point, but it's a libidinal thing, because psychoanalysis, look. One of the things that, working class person, work all day, go to a socialist meeting at night, and in some places, if you're in an urban area, you're going to be faced with a bunch of rules and regulations and, let's call it what it is, kind of PC dynamics in some cases. I would say there's an imminent critique of socialist institutional culture today, which is preventing the dissatisfaction to be spoken of and to be expressed in this sense. Preventing the libidinal rage to be let out. That's what socialist institutions and organizations should be about, right? And that's actually goes back to the point with Catherine, which is like, yeah, liberal institutions are Puritan right now. They don't like this kind of boisterous, antagonistic energy. For me, because of my family background, everybody yelled at each other. I had multiple divorces. That's actually home to me. I'm okay with antagonism. It's all right. Like, you know, I see both sides of it. So my point, I guess, is just that, like, you know, I don't know what my point is other than to say, like, maybe these streaming opportunities are places where people can express that antagonism in a way. And maybe it's an ethic of institutions to foster more opportunities for that, if that makes sense. Because I do agree with Catherine that, yeah, like, we got to reject that Puritan impulse, that super ego demand that's put on us. Otherwise, we are going to miss a lot of people who have, goes back to the insurrectionary piece and the kind of collective dissatisfaction. So,
yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. And I will see you in a few minutes. All right.
Awesome.